I am Dennis, 58 years old, and I have spent my entire life working hard to provide for my family, especially my daughter Melissa. I built my construction business from nothing, sacrificing everything to give her the best life possible. Yet here I sit at my own dinner table on Christmas Day, watching as Melissa hands out gifts to everyone but me. The pain is indescribable, but I keep my composure. They have no idea what truth I am about to reveal. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe to join our community of real-life stories that will touch your heart. My life story is not extraordinary, but it is one built on determination and hard work. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the son of a factory worker who taught me the value of honest labor. By 16, I was already working nights and weekends at the local hardware store while finishing high school. Those early years shaped my work ethic, showing me that nothing worth having comes easy. After graduation, I worked 3 jobs simultaneously to put myself through trade school. During the days, I apprenticed with a local builder. Evenings, I stocked shelves at a grocery store. Weekends, I mowed lawns and did odd repair jobs around the neighborhood. Sleep was a luxury I rarely afforded myself, but I had dreams of owning my own construction business someday. It was during this time that I met Judith. She was working as a receptionist at the dental office where I went to fix a broken tooth from a construction site accident. Despite my swollen jaw, I managed to ask her out, and to my surprise, she said yes. We were both young, ambitious, and struggling to make our way in the world. Judith believed in me from the beginning. When I talked about my dreams of having my own construction company, she encouraged me. We married after dating for 2 years, both of us just 23. We rented a tiny 1-bedroom apartment, saved every penny, and supported each other through the lean times. 3 years into our marriage, Judith told me she was pregnant. I still remember that moment clearly, standing in our small kitchen, the smell of the budget spaghetti dinner she had made filling the air. My hands were still rough from the worksite, my back aching from carrying lumber all day. But in that moment, none of that mattered. I was going to be a father. The day Melissa was born was the proudest moment of my life. Holding that tiny bundle in my arms, I made a silent promise that she would never know the struggles I had faced. She would have opportunities I could only dream of. That promise became my North Star, guiding every decision I made from that day forward. With a new baby at home, I worked harder than ever. I took on extra projects, often working through weekends and holidays. By the time Melissa was 3, I had saved enough to place a down payment on a small piece of land and start my own construction business. Dennis and Sons Construction. I called it, even though there were no sons yet. Just a dream for the future. The first few years of running my own business were brutal. I worked 80-hour weeks, taking any job I could get. Roofing renovations, small additions, nothing was beneath me. I would come home well after Melissa was asleep, my clothes covered in drywall dust, hands calloused and often bleeding. Judith would have saved me a plate of dinner, which I would eat alone at the kitchen table before collapsing into bed, only to rise before dawn and do it all again. But the sacrifice paid off. By the time Melissa started elementary school, my business had grown. I had a small crew working for me, a reliable client base, and a reputation for honest, quality work. We moved from our apartment to a modest 3-bedroom home. Nothing fancy, but it had a yard where Melissa could play and a good school district. I remember how proud she was to show me her room decorated with the princess wallpaper she had picked out herself. Those middle years were the happiest of my life. We were not rich by any means, but comfortable. Judith worked part-time at a local boutique, more for the social aspect than the money. Melissa was thriving in school, making friends, joining the soccer team. I coached her team on weekends, treasuring those moments when work did not intrude. I made sure Melissa never wanted for anything important. Dance lessons, summer camps, a computer for schoolwork, new clothes at the start of each school year. I started a college fund for her when she was born, adding to it monthly, determined that she would have the education I never did. The cracks in my marriage began to show when Melissa was around 12. Judith had grown increasingly dissatisfied with our life. The modest home that had once been a source of pride now seemed insufficient to her. She began comparing our lifestyle to those of her friends, many of whom had married professionals, lawyers, and doctors who provided more luxurious lives than I could. I tried to explain that I was building something sustainable, that flash and cash were not the same as security and stability. But Judith had changed. The woman who had once supported my dreams now seemed embarrassed by them. By me. By my work clothes and calloused hands and practical approach to money. The arguments increased in frequency and intensity. Melissa would retreat to her room during these fights, and it broke my heart to think of her listening to her parents at war. I suggested counseling, but Judith refused. Instead, she began spending more time away from home, shopping with friends, joining committees and clubs that kept her out most evenings. When Melissa turned 15, everything fell apart. I came home early one day, a rare occurrence, hoping to surprise Judith with flowers for our anniversary. Instead, I found evidence that she had not been alone in our home. A strange jacket hanging in the entryway, 2 wine glasses in the sink, the unmistakable scent of unfamiliar cologne lingering in our bedroom. I confronted Judith that evening after Melissa went to bed. She did not deny it. Harold was his name, a real estate developer who had moved to town recently. They had met at a fundraiser for the high school. He was everything I was not, according to Judith. Refined, cultured, wealthy. He had pursued her relentlessly, making her feel desired and appreciated in ways I apparently had not. I asked if she wanted to try to save our marriage. For a moment I thought I saw hesitation in her eyes, but then she straightened her shoulders and said no. She had already consulted a lawyer. She wanted a divorce. The next few months were a blur of pain and legal proceedings. Judith wanted full custody of Melissa, claiming my work schedule made me an unfit primary parent. She was not wrong about my hours, but the idea of losing daily contact with my daughter was unbearable. We eventually settled on joint custody, though Melissa would primarily live with her mother, with me getting weekends and 1 weeknight dinner. Within 6 months of our divorce finalizing, Judith married Harold. They moved into his sprawling house in the most expensive neighborhood in town, with a pool and a 3-car garage. Melissa got a bedroom 3 times the size of her old one, with an ensuite bathroom and a walk-in closet bigger than some apartments I had renovated. This is when the real pain began. Judith began subtly poisoning Melissa against me. Not in obvious ways that I could point to or fight against, just constant small comments and insinuations, that I had been an absent father, that I had prioritized work over family, that I had been stingy with money, that Harold was showing her what a real provider looked like. 15 is a vulnerable age, and Melissa was already struggling with the divorce. It became increasingly difficult to connect with her during our weekends together. She would be sullen and withdrawn, constantly texting her friends, or her mother counting the hours until she could return to the comfort and luxury of Harold's home. I kept trying. I maintained our weekend traditions, taking her hiking, teaching her to fish, cooking her favorite meals. But increasingly, she would cancel our plans last minute. A sleepover at a friend's house, a school project, a shopping trip with her mother. My time with her dwindled from full weekends to single afternoons to brief awkward dinners where she barely spoke. By the time Melissa entered her senior year of high school, I was lucky to see her once a month. She stopped answering my calls and texts consistently. I would show up for her soccer games and sit alone watching from a distance, as Judith and Harold cheered from the prime spots with the other wealthy parents. When college application time came, I offered to help. I had been saving for this moment her entire life. But Melissa informed me coldly that Harold would be handling her college expenses. She was applying to exclusive private universities, places with tuition costs. That made my heart sink, but apparently Harold had connections and money to spare. She was accepted to an expensive private university on the East Coast. I attended her high school graduation, sitting far back in the auditorium, watching as Harold and Judith took pictures with her afterward, not even acknowledging my presence. I sent her a heartfelt card, with a check representing a significant portion of my savings. The check was cashed, but I never received a thank you. Throughout her college years, my contact with Melissa diminished to almost nothing. I sent birthday and Christmas gifts that went unacknowledged. I emailed and called, receiving brief impersonal responses, if any. I kept tabs on her through social media, watching from a digital distance as she built a life that had no place for me. After college, Melissa took a job at Harold's development company. She met Thomas, a young architect from a wealthy family, at a company function. Their engagement was announced on social media. I learned about my daughter's wedding plans from a Facebook post rather than a phone call. I sent a generous gift and a note expressing my desire to attend the wedding. 3 days before the ceremony, I received a formal invitation, clearly an afterthought. At the wedding, I was seated at a back table with distant acquaintances, while Harold walked Melissa down the aisle. During his toast, he referred to her as the daughter he never had, but always wanted. I smiled politely and applauded along with everyone else, swallowing my pain with each sip of champagne. 2 years later, Melissa had twins, a boy and a girl. I learned of their birth through a group text sent to extended family and friends. I sent gifts and cards which received brief formal thank you notes, clearly written by a social secretary. My attempts to visit were deflected with claims of busy schedules and new parent exhaustion. This brings us to this past November, when I received an unexpected call from Melissa. Her voice was warmer than it had been in years, as she suggested that I host Christmas dinner at my house this year. She explained that Harold and Judith's home was being renovated and they needed an alternative venue. But she made it sound like she was doing me a favor, giving me the opportunity to have everyone over. I was so surprised and pleased by this olive branch that I immediately agreed, not caring about the reason. Which brings us to the preparations for the dinner that would change everything. The moment Melissa suggested I host Christmas dinner, my mind began racing with plans. This was my chance to reconnect with my daughter, to show her that despite everything, I still cared deeply. Perhaps in my own home away from Harold's mansion and influence, we might find some common ground again. I had 3 weeks to prepare, and I was determined to make everything perfect. My house, while well-maintained, was showing its age. The living room furniture was comfortable but worn, the kitchen appliances functional but outdated. I immediately began renovations, working evenings and weekends after my regular jobs. First, I repainted the entire main floor, choosing warm, inviting colors. I refinished the hardwood floors that had been hidden under carpeting for years. I replaced the old dining room set with a new table large enough to accommodate everyone. The old table had seated 4, comfortably 6 in a pinch. The new one could seat 12 with 2 leaves that extended it further if needed. The kitchen needed the most work. I installed new countertops, replaced the ancient refrigerator with a modern stainless steel model, and splurged on a professional grade range. Cooking had always been a hobby of mine, one that rarely saw use when I was eating alone. Now I would have the proper tools to prepare a feast. I took a rare day off work to drive to a home goods store in the next town over, spending hours selecting new dinnerware, glassware, and linens. I wanted everything to be perfect, to show Melissa that her old dad could create a beautiful home too, even without Harold's wealth. My longtime employee Frank noticed the changes in me during those weeks. "Boss, I have not seen you this energized in years," he commented one day as we finished up a job. "This dinner must be pretty important." "It is, Frank," I replied, unable to keep the hope from my voice. "My daughter is coming home for Christmas, with her husband and kids. First time in years they will all be here." Frank knew some of my history with Melissa. He had seen the photos on my desk, watched as they failed to update over the years, heard the one-sided phone conversations that grew increasingly brief and infrequent. "That is great, Dennis. Really great." His genuine happiness for me brought a lump to my throat. "You need help with anything, you just say the word. Anything at all." I took him up on that offer the weekend before Christmas, when we installed recessed lighting in the dining room and living room, replacing the outdated fixtures that had been there since I bought the place. We also built a small playpen area in the corner of the living room for Melissa's twins, complete with cheerful, child-safe furnishings and toys. As Christmas approached, I threw myself into planning the menu. I remembered all of Melissa's childhood favorites and planned to incorporate them into a traditional holiday feast. The brown sugar-glazed ham she had always preferred over turkey, the creamy mashed potatoes with extra butter, the green bean casserole with the crispy onions on top that she would pick off and eat first. And for dessert, my mother's recipe for apple pie that Melissa had once declared the best in the world. I also reached out to old friends for advice on reconnecting with estranged children. My friend Robert had gone through something similar with his son and had successfully rebuilt their relationship. "Be patient," he advised over coffee one morning. "Do not push too hard. Show interest in her life, but do not interrogate. And most importantly, do not dwell on the past or assign blame. Look forward, not backward." I took his words to heart, practicing what I might say to Melissa. Rehearsing casual questions about her work, her children, her interests. Preparing compliments that would sound sincere rather than desperate. Planning anecdotes about my own life that might amuse without seeming like I was competing for attention or sympathy. The week before Christmas, I shopped for gifts. This required careful consideration. I wanted to give Melissa something meaningful, but not overly sentimental. Something that acknowledged our shared past without dwelling on it. After much deliberation, I found a beautiful silver photo frame and placed within it a restored photograph of Melissa, at about 5 years old, sitting on my shoulders at a county fair, both of us laughing in the golden late afternoon sun. A happy memory from before everything fell apart. For her husband Thomas, whom I barely knew, I selected a high-quality leather portfolio, the kind architects often use for presentations. For the twins, now 2 years old, and whom I had only seen in Facebook photos, I bought educational toys appropriate for their age, wrapping them in bright paper with big bows. I also purchased gifts for Judith and Harold, though this was more difficult. For Judith, a cashmere scarf in the blue shade she had always favored. For Harold, an expensive bottle of scotch. These were polite gifts, the kind given out of social obligation rather than genuine warmth, but I was determined to maintain the high ground. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. I had been up since 5, too anxious to sleep. I put the ham in the oven, prepared side dishes, and set the dining room table with careful precision. The good china gleamed under the new lighting. Fresh evergreen boughs and red candles formed a centerpiece that looked like something from a magazine. The Christmas tree in the living room was tastefully decorated with wrapped presents arranged neatly beneath. At 11, I showered and changed into new clothes purchased specifically for the occasion. Dark slacks, a forest green sweater over a collared shirt, polished shoes. I even splurged on a haircut the day before, something I normally did myself to save money. The doorbell rang at exactly noon. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door to find Judith and Harold standing on my porch, their expressions a mixture of politeness and poorly concealed judgment. Judith had aged well, her blonde hair now expertly highlighted to conceal any gray, her figure still slim in an expensive wool coat. Harold was tall and distinguished-looking, with silver hair and the confident posture of a man accustomed to being in charge. "Dennis," Judith said, leaning in for the briefest of cheek kisses. "The house looks nice. You have done some work on it." "Thank you," I replied, stepping back to let them in. "Can I take your coats?" Harold handed me his cashmere overcoat without really looking at me. "Something smells good," he commented, his tone suggesting surprise. "Ham," I said, "and all the fixings. Please make yourselves comfortable. Can I get you a drink?" This began an awkward dance of politeness. They accepted drinks, commented on the decorations, and settled into the living room with the air of people determined to make the best of an uncomfortable situation. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. My heart leapt. This would be Melissa. I opened the door, and there she stood with Thomas beside her, each holding one of the twins. Melissa had her mother's slim build and blonde hair, but her eyes were mine, a deep brown that I had once been able to read like a book. Now they were guarded as she offered a tight smile. "Hi, Dad," she said. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," I replied, fighting the urge to pull her into a hug. "Please come in. Let me meet these little ones properly." The twins Jake and Emma were beautiful children with rosy cheeks and curious eyes. Jake had a mop of brown hair like his father, while Emma was fair like Melissa. They regarded me with the natural suspicion of toddlers meeting a stranger, which is what I was to them, despite being their grandfather. Thomas shook my hand firmly. He was a good-looking man in his early 30s with an air of confidence that spoke of a privileged upbringing. "Nice place you have here, Dennis," he said, glancing around with the appraising eye of someone who works in real estate. I could almost see him calculating the square footage and property value, finding it wanting. "Thank you," I said simply. "Please join the others in the living room. I will bring some appetizers." The next hour passed in a blur of surface-level conversation. Weather, traffic, innocuous current events. Judith dominated much of the discussion, detailing their recent Mediterranean cruise and plans for a ski trip to Aspen after the new year. Harold occasionally interjected with comments about the real estate market or his golf game. Melissa spoke mainly to her mother or focused on the twins who were exploring the playpen area I had created. I kept busy serving drinks and appetizers, trying to find moments to connect with Melissa, but she seemed determined to keep our interactions brief and impersonal. When I mentioned a funny memory from her childhood, she corrected details in a way that made it clear the memory held no special place in her heart. "That was the summer before 5th grade, not 4th, she said dismissively. "And it was Aunt Carol's lake house, not a public beach." "Of course," I said, swallowing my disappointment. "You always did have the better memory." Thomas made several comments about my home that were framed as compliments, but felt condescending. "The renovation work is quite good for a place this age," he remarked at one point. "You have made the most of the space available." I noticed how Melissa lavished attention on Harold, seeking his opinion on everything from the twins' development to her recent work projects. She called him Dad with an ease that stabbed at my heart, especially when she addressed me as Dennis when speaking about me to others. Despite these small wounds, I maintained my composure and focus on hosting duties. When it was time for dinner, I called everyone to the table, taking pride in the spread I had prepared. The ham glistened with its sweet glaze. Side dishes steamed in serving bowls. The good wine I had splurged on was poured into crystal glasses, another recent purchase. As we settled around the table, I found myself at one end with Harold at the other, the patriarch's position. This seating arrangement had not been my intention, but somehow it happened naturally, everyone assuming Harold would take the head of the table even in my home. Dinner conversation flowed more easily with the aid of food and wine. The twins provided comic relief with their toddler antics, dropping food and declaring likes and dislikes with dramatic emphasis. I watched aching as they interacted comfortably with Harold and Judith, clearly accustomed to their presence. They called them Grandpa and Grandma without hesitation. They had no name for me yet. Throughout the meal, I caught glimpses of the daughter I remembered. A certain laugh when Emma did something silly. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when considering a question. Small mannerisms that had survived the years and distance. I also saw flashes of the girl who had once adored me. When she took her first bite of the green bean casserole, a look of pleasure and recognition crossed her face. "This tastes exactly like I remember," she said, the first genuine comment directed at me all day. "Your favorite," I replied, smiling. "Some recipes should never change." For a moment her expression softened, and I thought we might have found a bridge across the chasm between us. But then Harold launched into a story about the gourmet green bean dish they had been served at some exclusive restaurant in New York, and the moment was lost. As the meal concluded, and I began clearing plates to make way for dessert, Melissa stood up, clapping her hands lightly for attention. "Before we have dessert, I thought this would be a good time for gifts," she announced. My heart lifted. Perhaps this was the moment of reconnection I had been hoping for. I began mentally rehearsing my reaction to her gift, determined to show appropriate appreciation, no matter what it might be. "I will go get them," Melissa said, heading to the entryway where several shopping bags had been deposited upon their arrival. She returned with an armful of beautifully wrapped packages, setting them on the coffee table in the living room. We all moved from the dining area to the living room, the adults taking seats while the twins bounced with excitement at the prospect of more presents. Melissa took on the role of gift distributor with a ceremonious air. "First for Mom," she said, handing Judith a small, elegantly wrapped box. Inside was a pair of diamond earrings that made Judith gasp with pleasure. "Next for Dad." Melissa continued, passing a package to Harold. It contained a rare first edition book related to his favorite hobby, collecting historical maps. His expression of delight was genuine as he examined it carefully. "For Thomas," she continued, presenting her husband with a sleek new tablet he had apparently been wanting. Even the twins received additional gifts, despite the abundance already waiting for them at home, according to Judith's earlier comments. I sat quietly waiting for my turn, maintaining what I hoped was an expression of pleasant anticipation. But as the pile of gifts dwindled and everyone exclaimed over their presents, a cold realization began to seep into my consciousness. There was nothing for me. The last gift was distributed, a cashmere sweater for Judith's sister, who would be joining them later for evening drinks. The colorful wrapping paper lay strewn across the floor. Everyone was admiring their gifts, thanking Melissa for her thoughtfulness. And I sat empty-handed, the odd man out in a room full of family. The silence that followed was excruciating. I could see the moment when others realized what had happened. Thomas looked uncomfortable. Judith shot Melissa a questioning glance. Harold, however, had a barely perceptible smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Oh," Melissa said finally, her tone casual but her eyes avoiding mine. "I guess I forgot something. Or maybe I left yours at home, Dad. Sorry about that." The dismissive way she said it made it clear this was no oversight. It was a deliberate exclusion, a public statement about my place or lack thereof in her life. In that moment, I had a choice. I could create a scene, demand an explanation, make everyone as uncomfortable as I felt. I could slink away in humiliated silence, or I could maintain my dignity. I chose the latter. No problem at all, I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. The pleasure of having everyone here is gift enough for me. Judith looked relieved at my response. Thomas still seemed uncomfortable. The twins, bless them, were oblivious, playing with their new toys. Harold's smirk had morphed into a self-satisfied smile. I need to check on the pie, I said, standing up. Coffee, anyone? There were murmured assents, and I escaped to the kitchen, grateful for the moment alone. I stood at the counter, hands braced against the edge, taking deep breaths. I reminded myself that this was not about presents. I had never cared about material things. But the symbolism of being the only one excluded cut deep. I composed myself, removed the perfectly golden pie from the oven, where it had been keeping warm, and prepared a tray of coffee cups. By the time I returned to the living room, the conversation had moved on. The wrapping paper had been cleared away. My exclusion from the gift exchange was apparently not worth dwelling on. I served dessert and coffee with the same care I had shown throughout the meal. Compliments on the pie were offered. Melissa acknowledged that it was just like Grandma used to make, the closest thing to warmth she had shown me all day. As we finished our dessert, I excused myself briefly, needing another moment alone. I went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, my eye catching a photograph on the nightstand. It showed me holding newborn Melissa in the hospital, my face a mixture of terror and adoration as I cradled this tiny human who had instantly become the center of my universe. 20 minutes of solitude was all I allowed myself. When I returned to the living room, I found the family discussing vacation plans for the coming year. A summer rental on Cape Cod. Perhaps a trip to Disney World for the twins. You should join us, Dad, Harold was saying to Melissa as I entered. The house has plenty of room, and the kids would love having you all there. I noticed there was no suggestion that I might be included in these plans. Not that I had expected it, but the casual way they planned family gatherings that excluded me reinforced my outsider status. I began collecting coffee cups, moving quietly around the periphery of their conversation. As I passed behind the sofa where Melissa and Judith sat, I overheard Judith speaking in a low voice. "Did you really forget his gift, or was that intentional?" she asked. Melissa's reply, not meant for my ears, froze me in place. "He does not deserve one," she said coldly. "Not after being absent for so many years. Not after all the birthdays and school events he missed. He made his choices." I continued to the kitchen, these words echoing in my head. This then was the story she had been told. That I had chosen to be absent. That I had willfully missed those moments in her life. When I returned, Harold was standing, raising his glass in a toast. "I would like to thank Dennis for hosting us today," he began with practiced charm. "And I would like to propose a toast to family, the greatest gift of all." Everyone raised their glasses. Then Harold continued, looking directly at Melissa. "And a special toast to you, my girl. I may not be your biological father, but being your dad has been the greatest privilege of my life. Thank you for allowing me to be the father you needed and deserved." The room fell silent as these words hung in the air. Judith beamed at her husband. Thomas nodded approvingly. Melissa looked at Harold with naked adoration. Something shifted inside me then. A lifetime of swallowed words and suppressed truths rose up, demanding release. Not in anger or bitterness, but simply because it was time for the truth to be spoken. I stood slowly, my movement drawing all eyes to me. "I would like to say something as well," I said, my voice quiet but firm. The surprised expressions around the room might have been comical under other circumstances. I had played my role of agreeable host so well that this departure from script clearly caught them off guard. "Please give me a few minutes," I continued. "I need to get something from my office." Without waiting for a response, I walked down the hallway to the small room that served as my home office. There, in the bottom drawer of my desk, was a worn leather portfolio I had kept updated faithfully for 17 years. I took it out, held it for a moment, then returned to the living room. Everyone was waiting in uncomfortable silence. The twins had fallen asleep on a blanket in the playpen, their new toys clutched in small hands. "I have been hearing stories today." I began standing before them all. Stories about family, about fatherhood, about choices and absences. I have heard them not just today, but for years in fragments and whispers and assumptions. Now I would like to share some documentation that might add context to these stories. I opened the portfolio and removed the first set of papers. These are the records of child support payments I made for Melissa from the time of our divorce until her 18th birthday. You will notice they are consistently higher than the court-mandated amount. I passed the papers to Thomas, who looked at them with the professional interest of someone who understands financial documents, then handed them to Melissa. Her expression remained neutral, but a small crease appeared between her brows. "Next," I continued, "are the bank statements showing my contributions to Melissa's college fund, which began the day she was born and continued monthly without fail." I handed these to Melissa directly. "You may have been told that Harold paid for your education. He contributed, certainly, but this fund covered approximately 60% of your tuition and expenses." Judith shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Harold's expression had darkened considerably. "Here," I said, removing another folder, "are copies of cards and letters I sent to Melissa throughout her high school and college years. You will note that many are marked 'Return to Sender' or show no evidence of having been opened. I did not hand these over, simply held them up for all to see." Melissa's face had paled slightly. "And these," I continued, my voice still calm, "are records of attempted visits, invitations, and phone calls that were rejected or ignored over the years." The room was utterly silent now. Even the Christmas music playing softly in the background seemed to have paused. "But perhaps most interesting," I said, removing a final set of documents, "is this record of a transaction made 5 years ago. When Melissa was planning her wedding, I understand Harold initially agreed to pay for it, then rescinded his offer when the budget exceeded his expectations." Harold's face reddened. This was clearly not common knowledge. "The $25,000 that mysteriously appeared in your account, Melissa allowing you to have the wedding you had dreamed of, that did not come from Harold reconsidering. It came from me through a discreet arrangement with the wedding planner, who agreed not to reveal the source of the funds. I took a second mortgage on this house to provide that gift." Melissa's eyes widened, her gaze darting between me and Harold, who was now staring at the floor. "Finally," I said, returning to the portfolio, "there is this." I removed a copy of financial statements showing a trust fund I had established for Melissa when she was born. "I have been contributing to this fund for 32 years. It has grown significantly. You are the sole beneficiary, Melissa. It passes to your children should anything happen to you." I placed the documents on the coffee table. "I have never mentioned this fund because it was intended as a safety net, not a means of buying your affection. My will contains similar provisions. Despite our estrangement, you and your children remain my primary heirs." I paused, looking at the medical records I still held in my hand. "There is one more thing. These are medical records showing the cumulative physical effects of working 70 to 80-hour weeks for over a decade. The back surgeries, the repetitive strain injuries, the stress-related conditions. I do not share these for sympathy, but for context. The work that supposedly took me away from you, Melissa, was always for you, always. The silence that followed was profound. Judith looked as though she might be ill. Harold's face had gone from red to ashen. Thomas was studying the financial documents with increasing discomfort. And Melissa sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable. I do not share any of this to demand gratitude or to assign blame, I said finally. I share it because I believe the truth matters. I have made my peace with the choices I made. I would make them again. Love does not require recognition to be real, but respect, I think, requires truth. With that, I gathered the documents and returned them to the portfolio. Now I believe I promised Pi. Would anyone care for seconds? The aftermath of my revelation was not the dramatic scene one might expect. There were no tearful apologies, no immediate reconciliations. Instead, an awkward silence descended as everyone processed what they had just learned. Harold was the first to move, checking his watch and muttering something about another engagement. Judith followed his lead, thanking me stiffly for dinner as they collected their coats. The twins remained asleep in the playpen, oblivious to the tension surrounding them. Thomas made a show of helping with cleanup, perhaps to escape the weight of unspoken words between Melissa and me. I accepted his assistance graciously, maintaining the calm, dignified demeanor I had adopted throughout the day. As Harold and Judith prepared to leave, taking their gifts with them, Melissa approached them. "You go ahead," she said quietly. "We will stay a bit longer. The twins are sleeping so peacefully, it seems a shame to wake them just yet." The surprise on their faces mirrored my own, though I was careful not to show it. With brief, uncomfortable goodbyes, Harold and Judith departed, leaving an almost palpable relief in their wake. Thomas, sensing the need for space, announced he would wait in the car, giving Melissa and me time to talk. He gathered their belongings, but left the sleeping twins where they were closing the front door quietly behind him. Melissa and I stood in the living room, the remnants of Christmas dinner surrounding us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the silence. "Why did you never tell me any of this before?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I considered my answer carefully, wanting to be honest without accusation. At first, I thought the truth would be evident in my actions. Later, when I realized you were being told a different narrative, any attempt to defend myself seemed like attacking your mother and Harold. I did not want to put you in the middle of adult conflicts more than you already were. Melissa sank onto the sofa, looking suddenly exhausted. I do not know what to say, or what to believe. The documents speak for themselves, I replied gently. But more importantly, what do you remember from your childhood before the divorce? What does your heart tell you about who I was as a father? She looked up at me, then really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. I remember you being tired a lot, she said slowly. But I also remember you never missing my soccer games. I remember you helping with science projects, even when you had been working all day. I remember the camping trips, just the two of us. Yes, I said simply. Then somewhere along the way that all changed in my mind. The narrative shifted. You became the father who chose work over family, who abandoned us for his own selfish purposes. She shook her head, as if trying to reconcile two contradictory truths. Mom would point out all the things Harold could provide that you could not. The vacations, the clothes, the connections. It became a constant comparison, and you always came up wanting. Material things are easier to provide when you inherit wealth rather than build it from nothing, I observed without rancor. Melissa nodded slowly. After the divorce, when I would come back from weekends with you, Mom would question me extensively. Were you on your phone with work? Did you leave me alone to handle business? Did you buy cheap food? Every detail of our time together was examined and usually found lacking in some way. And as a child, you had no way to evaluate those judgments, I said. No context for understanding the complexities of adult relationships and responsibilities. No, she agreed. I just knew that agreeing with Mom and Harold made my life easier. And eventually, I started to believe it all myself. I sat down beside her, careful to maintain some distance. I am not perfect, Melissa. I made mistakes. I probably did work too much trying to build a secure future for you. I was not as sophisticated or educated as Harold. I could not provide the lifestyle they could. But I never ever stopped loving you or trying to be part of your life. She looked at the sleeping faces of her children. The wedding money, she said quietly. I always wondered where that came from. Harold had been so adamant about his budget, then suddenly changed his mind. He accepted the credit without ever saying he had reconsidered. It was worth every penny to know you had the day you wanted, I said simply. And my college tuition, Mom always said Harold paid for everything. He contributed significantly, I acknowledged. But so did I. The fund I started when you were born grew well over the years. Melissa was quiet for a long moment. I do not know how to process all of this, she finally said. It is like discovering my entire understanding of the past 20 years has been built on quicksand. Take time, I advised. Examine the documents. Reflect on your own memories. I am not asking you to choose sides or to suddenly transform our relationship. Truth takes time to settle in. She nodded, then looked at me with eyes that reminded me so much of the little girl who used to run to meet me at the door when I came home from work. I am sorry about the gift, she said. That was deliberately cruel, and I have no excuse for it. It hurt, I admitted. Not the lack of a present, but what it symbolized. But that moment led to this conversation, so perhaps it was a gift, after all, in its way. A small smile touched her lips. You always could find the silver lining. A necessary skill in the construction business, I replied with my own slight smile. Things rarely go exactly as planned. You adapt or you fail. We sat in a more comfortable silence than watching her children sleep. After a few minutes, she spoke again. Would you like to really meet your grandchildren properly, I mean? Not just today, but regularly. The question caught me off guard, hope rising so quickly I had to temper it with caution. I would like that very much, I said carefully, but only if it is something you truly want, not something offered out of guilt or obligation. I do want it, she said with unexpected firmness. Whatever issues lie between us, my children deserve to know their grandfather. The real one, not the version I was taught to see. And this simple statement held more healing power than any apology could have. Thank you, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. Maybe we could start with dinner, she suggested. Next week, just the four of us without all the... She gestured vaguely, encompassing the complicated dynamics we had navigated today. I would like that, I said, not trying to hide my pleasure at the prospect. We talked a while longer, tentatively exploring what a renewed relationship might look like. No dramatic declarations or promises, just small, practical steps forward. When the twins began to stir, Melissa gathered them up, still drowsy and confused. Say goodbye to Grandpa, she told them gently. They regarded me with sleepy curiosity. Emma gave a shy wave. Jake, more bold, stepped forward and offered me a slightly sticky hand to shake, a comically adult gesture from such a small person. Bye, Gampa. He said the word new and unpracticed on his tongue. Goodbye, Jake, I replied solemnly, shaking his tiny hand. It was very nice to meet you. As they prepared to leave, Melissa paused at the door. Thank you for dinner, she said, and for the truth. You are welcome here any time, I told her. All of you. After they left, I stood in the quiet house surrounded by the evidence of the day. Dirty dishes, empty glasses, discarded wrapping paper I had missed in the cleanup. Under normal circumstances, the sight might have been depressing, a reminder of an event over and done with. Instead, I felt a curious lightness. Not happiness exactly, at least not yet, but possibility. A door that had been firmly closed for years now stood slightly ajar. The following weeks brought cautious but steady progress. Melissa kept her word about dinner the following week. We met at a restaurant neutral territory that removed the pressures of hosting. The twins were better behaved than one might expect from 2-year-olds in a public setting, though Emma did launch a roll across the room with impressive force at one point. That dinner led to another and then another. Soon, Melissa began bringing the children to my house on Saturday mornings. I cleared space in the garage and set up a small woodworking area suitable for very young apprentices. Jake proved particularly interested, solemnly donning the child-sized safety goggles I purchased and helping me sand pieces of wood into increasingly recognizable shapes. Emma preferred baking, standing on a step stool at the kitchen counter, her small hands covered in flour, as we made simple cookies and muffins together. She had her mother's focus and determination, insisting on doing as much as possible herself. Thomas joined us occasionally, initially wary, but gradually warming as he saw the positive effect these visits had on his children. He and I discovered a shared interest in historical architecture that gave us common ground for conversation. Melissa began calling me more regularly sometimes with specific questions about the twins or household repairs, sometimes just to check in. Our conversations remained somewhat careful, neither of us yet ready to delve into the deeper hurts of the past, but genuine nonetheless. 3 months after that fateful Christmas, Melissa called with news. Mom and Harold are separating, she said without preamble when I answered the phone. I am sorry to hear that, I replied, and meant it. Despite everything, I did not wish Judith unhappiness. It has been coming for a while, Melissa continued. But I think Christmas was a turning point. Mom confronted Harold about the wedding money and other things after we left your house. Apparently, there have been similar deceptions throughout their marriage. That is unfortunate, I said neutrally. I have been thinking a lot about truth and stories lately, Melissa said after a pause. About how the narratives we believe shape our perceptions and actions. Mom called me yesterday, apologizing for things she said about you over the years. I think she is doing some serious reflection of her own. That must have been a difficult conversation, I observed. It was, Melissa acknowledged, but necessary. I have been in therapy trying to untangle all of this. The therapist says it is common for children of divorce to be manipulated in the way I was, but that does not excuse my own behavior as an adult. I had choices too. You were working with the information you had, I said gently. Maybe, but I could have questioned more, observed more, remembered more. She sighed. Anyway, I just wanted you to know about Mom and Harold, and to say again that I am sorry for believing the worst about you for so long. Thank you, I said simply. How are the kids? She accepted the change of subject, gracefully updating me on the twins' latest adventures before ending the call. This was our new pattern, small steps forward retreat, when emotions threatened to overwhelm, then another tentative step ahead. By the time the next Christmas approached, much had changed. Melissa and I spoke several times a week. The twins spent one weekend a month with me, giving their parents a much-appreciated break and allowing me to build a real relationship with my grandchildren. Thomas and I had gone fishing together, twice experiences, that helped him understand my world better. Judith had moved into a modest apartment after the divorce was finalized. Her own reassessment of priorities led to a tentative rapprochement between us, civil, if not warm. Harold had relocated to Florida, effectively removing himself from our immediate family circle. For this Christmas, Melissa suggested a smaller gathering at my house again, just her immediate family, and Judith, who would come for dessert only. Less pressure, more genuine connection, she explained. I agreed readily, though I found myself spending far less time preparing than I had the previous year. The physical trappings seemed less important now that real bonds were being formed. On Christmas morning, I woke to the sound of my doorbell. Opening the door, I found Melissa and her family on the porch, the twins dancing with excitement. "Merry Christmas, Dad," Melissa said, the term of endearment now natural and frequent. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," I replied, bending down to receive enthusiastic hugs from Jake and Emma. "Grandpa, did Santa come to your house too?" Jake asked urgently as I ushered them inside. "Let us go see," I suggested, leading him to the tree where presents awaited. The day unfolded with a relaxed warmth that had been entirely absent the year before. We opened gifts with no agenda beyond the pleasure of giving and receiving. The twins exclaimed over the wooden toy kitchen I had built them, complete with working features appropriate for their age. Thomas appreciated the rare architectural book I had found. Melissa opened the small jewelry box containing her grandmother's restored locket, tears springing to her eyes as she recognized it. "I thought this was lost," she whispered. "I have been saving it," I explained, waiting for the right time. When it was my turn, Melissa handed me a package wrapped in simple red paper. "It is not much," she said almost shyly. Inside was a handmade album. The first page showed a photograph of me holding newborn Melissa, identical to the one I kept by my bed. Subsequent pages documented our journey from early father-daughter moments through the difficult years of separation to recent photos of me with the twins. The final page held a handwritten note that simply said, "Thank you for never giving up on me. I love you, Dad." No diamond cufflinks or expensive gadget could have meant more. This gift acknowledged our shared past, both painful and precious, and affirmed our continuing journey forward. "Thank you," I said, not bothering to hide the emotion in my voice. Later, after dinner had been eaten, and Judith had made her brief, somewhat awkward appearance for dessert, I found myself alone with Melissa in the kitchen as we cleaned up. "Do you know what I have learned this year?" she asked, drying a plate I had just washed. "What is that?" "That healing does not come from revenge or dramatic confrontations. It comes from truth simply presented and allowed to do its work." She placed the dried plate in the cabinet. "When you showed those documents last Christmas, you did not yell or accuse. You just presented facts and let them speak for themselves. That made it impossible to dismiss them as bitterness or manipulation." I nodded, considering her words. "I had years to work through my anger," I admitted. "By the time I showed you those papers, it was about truth, not vindication." "Well, it worked," she said with a small smile. "Better than any dramatic speech or emotional appeal could have." "I am just grateful we found our way back to each other," I said. "However it happened." Melissa leaned against the counter, watching me with thoughtful eyes. "Do you ever regret all those years of hard work, the physical toll it took, the time away from home?" I considered the question carefully. "I regret that my work was used as a weapon against me in your mind. I regret not finding a better balance sometimes. But no, I do not regret working hard to provide for you, to build something of value, to give you opportunities. That was always my choice, made freely and with love." She nodded, accepting my answer. "I hope I can teach my children what you have taught me this year about dignity and patience. about how strength does not always roar, but sometimes simply stands its ground quietly until the truth is heard. "You will teach them in your own way," I assured her. "You are a wonderful mother." "I had a good example," she said softly, "even if it took me too long to recognize it." We finished the dishes in companionable silence, then rejoined Thomas and the twins in the living room. The rest of the day passed in the simple pleasures of family time, building with new toys, reading new books, sharing memories, and making plans for the future. As they prepared to leave that evening, Melissa hugged me tightly. "Merry Christmas, Dad," she whispered. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," I replied. The merriest in many years. After closing the door behind them, I stood in my quiet house reflecting on the journey of the past year. From isolation to connection, from misunderstanding to truth, from pain to healing. The path had not been easy or straightforward. There had been difficult conversations, moments of doubt, old wounds reopened before they could truly heal. But we had persevered one small step at a time, building a new relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. I picked up the photo album Melissa had given me, turning its pages, slowly tracing our shared history with my fingertips. The final blank pages seemed to me a promise waiting to be filled with new memories yet to be made. There is a particular kind of peace that comes not from having everything you want, but from being at peace with what you have. Standing in my modest living room, surrounded by the evidence of a day spent with family, who had returned to me not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet truth, I felt that peace settled deep in my soul. The greatest gift I realized was not that I had won some victory or gained some validation. It was that truth quietly maintained had finally been heard. And in being heard, had set us all free to build something new and genuine together. Have you ever experienced a moment when standing in your truth changed everything? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story touched you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more tales of healing and redemption. Share this with someone who might need to hear that patience and dignity sometimes speak louder than words. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the quietest voices carry the most powerful truths.